300 alien warriors stood on that field, and every single one of them wanted him dead. He wasn't their strongest. He wasn't their best. He wasn't even trying to be a hero. And that is exactly what should terrify you. Asterisk. The transport doors hissed open, and the entire hangar of Caldris Military Academy went silent. Cadet Marcus Reyes stepped out into gravity that felt almost right, under a sky the color of rusted copper, and immediately understood he was the only human for 400 light-years in any direction. Nobody said anything. They didn't have to. 300 cadets. Dravith warforms with plated hides, Senkai twins moving in perfect synchronized silence, a lone Threxian towering 9 feet tall with claws like harvesting sickles. All turned to look at the soft, pink, hairless thing standing at the base of the ramp with a duffel bag over one shoulder. "There's been a mistake," said the registrar. A small gray-skinned Ithior named Vosk, scrolling through a tablet with obvious discomfort. "Predator Academy doesn't accept your classification." "I got the acceptance beacon," Marcus said. "Same as everyone else." "Yes, a clerical error at Sector Command. Humans are registered under Sapient Combat Adjacent in the old database. You were meant for logistics training, not this." Vosk frowned at his tablet, tapping the entry twice as if it might correct itself. "Though I'll note the override authorization on your file is dated 3 months before your name even entered the recruitment pool. Strange thing for a clerical error to do, arrange itself ahead of time." He shook his head, dismissing it. "Bureaucracy. Pay it no mind." Marcus looked past him, at the training yard where 2 Dravith cadets were sparring hard enough to crack the reinforced floor tile beneath them. "Can I stay anyway?" Vosk blinked all 3 eyelids at once. Behind him, a ripple of low growls moved through the crowd, something between amusement and disgust. A Dravith near the front bared a row of teeth built for tearing armor plating and said something in a clicking dialect that didn't need translating. "You don't understand the request," Vosk said carefully. "This academy trains Apex combat cadets for the Coalition's frontier fleets. Cadets here have died in training. Officially for this cycle. Unofficially more. Your species," he hesitated, choosing the word with visible care, "is not built for that kind of attrition." "I understand the request fine," Marcus said. "I'd like to stay." "You'll die in the first week," said a voice. It belonged to Threx Kale, the towering cadet, who had shouldered his way to the front. His voice carried the particular flatness of a predator who had genuinely never considered a human worth raising his voice at. "This is not an insult. It's an observation. Your species has no claws, no plating, no venom. You run at 40 kilometers an hour when frightened, which is slower than our children." "Noted," Marcus said. "You should leave." "I'd rather not." Kale tilted his head. The closest a Threxian came to genuine confusion. Predators understood fear. They understood aggression, hierarchy, dominance displays. What they didn't have a category for was a small, unarmored thing looking up at 9 feet of muscle and simply declining to be afraid. "You are aware," Kale said slowly, "that I could end this conversation in one motion." "I'm aware. And you're still not moving." "No." A murmur passed through the gathered cadets, not respect, not yet, but something adjacent to it. The particular unease predators feel when a data point refuses to fit the model. Kale studied him another long moment, claws flexing once at his sides. A gesture Marcus would later learn was a Threxian's version of thinking out loud. "Interesting," Kale finally said, and walked away, which among Threxians was as close to a warning as a first meeting got. Vosk exhaled, several of his gray folds smoothing in visible relief now that the confrontation had passed without violence. He tapped at his tablet again, entered something, and sighed. "I cannot authorize combat enrollment. What I can do," he said, "is authorize a provisional trial period. 30 days. If you survive the first major evaluation, the classification error becomes irrelevant. Academy policy allows performance to override paperwork. If you don't..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. 30 days, Marcus repeated. "Cadet Reyes, I want to be clear because I don't think Sector Command was. Nobody here expects you to reach that evaluation. The kindest interpretation among the staff is that you'll wash out quietly. The less kind interpretation is currently being discussed in at least 4 different dormitory wings. Understood. Then welcome to Cauldrus, Vosk said. In the tone of someone signing a form, he fully expected to be reversing within a week. Marcus picked up his duffel bag and walked into the yard alone, past rows of cadets who parted for him not out of courtesy, but the way a crowd parts around something it hasn't yet decided is worth touching. The dormitory assigned to Marcus was a converted storage bay. Nobody had planned for a human, so nobody had built him a room. He didn't complain. He unpacked his single duffel bag onto a shelf built for creatures twice his size and sat on the floor because there was no furniture built for human joints. That night, 3 cadets came to see if the rumors were true. They didn't knock. Predator Academy dormitories didn't have locks, because Predator Academy cadets didn't believe in privacy as a right, only as a thing you were strong enough to enforce. The Senkai twins entered first, moving with that unsettling mirrored silence, followed by a Dravith cadet Marcus hadn't been introduced to. The Dravith's plating was scarred from real combat, not training, a veteran transfer, not a first year. "We heard a human enrolled," the Dravith said. "We wanted to see it before it dies." "I'm right here," Marcus said. "You can talk to me instead of about me." The Dravith laughed, a wet, clicking sound. "Why? You won't remember this conversation. None of us remember the ones who don't survive week 1. How many don't survive? Formally? None. The Academy doesn't kill cadets." The Dravith's plates flared, just slightly, in a display Marcus didn't yet know how to read. Unofficially, the training yard settles a great many arguments the instructors never hear about. The Senkai twins hadn't spoken. They were watching Marcus's hands, his stance, the way his weight was distributed. Reading him the way predators read prey, cataloging weaknesses. "You're not going to threaten me?" Marcus asked. "Threats are for creatures who might listen," the Dravith said. "We came to look. Now we've looked." They left. The door, doorless as it was, seemed to exhale after them. Marcus sat back down on the floor of his converted storage room and, for the first time since the transport had touched down, allowed himself a single long breath. He didn't unpack the item at the bottom of his duffel bag. A folded strip of cloth, and beneath it, a set of tags that weren't his. Elena Reyes. Not yet. There would be time for that later, when it mattered, when the Academy had seen enough of what they expected to see that the thing underneath would land harder. He'd carried those tags 400 light-years for a reason he hadn't said out loud to anyone. Not even the recruiter who'd flagged his file, not even Vosk. Especially not Vosk. For now, he needed sleep because tomorrow was the first trial, and the first trial at Predator Academy had a name whispered by every species in the galaxy with something like reverence. They called it the Culling Field, and no human had ever walked onto it. The Culling Field was not a field. It was a crater 3 kilometers wide, ringed by observation platforms, its floor a shifting maze of collapsed structures, live weapons fire, and creatures the Academy released specifically to remind cadets that the galaxy did not owe them survival. "Objective is simple," said the instructor, a scarred Threxian named Drask who had run the Culling Field for 11 cycles and lost exactly 4 cadets to it. A number he wore like a medal. "Reach the beacon at the crater's center. First 20 to arrive pass. Everyone else repeats the trial next week. Or doesn't." 300 cadets lined the rim. Marcus stood at the end of the row and nobody stood near him, not out of respect, but because standing near him was seen correctly as a wasted tactical position. "Human," Drask said, not looking up from his tablet. "You have 60 seconds before the field arms. I'd suggest using them to find cover, not glory." "How many species have passed this trial on their first attempt?" Marcus asked. Drask finally looked up. "None from a first-year cohort in 3 cycles." "Why?" "Just curious what the bar is." "The bar," Drask said, "is survival. Everything past that is decoration." He turned back to his tablet, dismissing the exchange, and raised his voice to the full line of cadets. 30 seconds. Somewhere down the rim, the Dravith veteran who'd visited Marcus's dormitory the night before caught his eye and gave the smallest possible shake of his head. Not encouragement, not quite a warning either. Something closer to "I already told you how this ends." The horn sounded. What happened over the next 40 minutes would be discussed in the Academy's mess hall for the rest of the term, though not one witness could agree afterward on exactly what they'd seen, because what they'd seen didn't fit anything they already believed about humans. Marcus didn't run for the beacon. He ran for the sound of screaming. A first-year Ithior cadet, small, unarmored, barely older than a hatchling, had gone down under collapsed rubble 40 meters from the rim, pinned, calling for help nobody was coming to give, because helping her cost time, and time in the culling field was the only currency that mattered. Marcus reached her in under a minute, threw his weight against a support beam that outweighed him by a factor of 6, and did not move it. Not with strength. Strength wasn't the tool. He wedged a length of scrap into the gap as a lever, found the angle a heavier creature would never have needed to look for, and pulled her free as automated weapons fire chewed the wall above them into dust. "Why?" she gasped, staring at him. "Would you do that? You lose ranking time. You were going to die. I'm not your species. I'm not your ally. We're not even in the same trial group." Marcus looked at her like the question didn't quite parse. "Doesn't matter," he said, and kept moving. He reached the beacon in position 211 out of 300. He failed the trial, technically. He would repeat it next week, technically. Nobody in Academy history cared less about a technicality. That night, Kale found him in the mess hall, sitting alone, eating something the kitchen staff had clearly prepared without any idea what humans could digest. "You failed," Kale said, sitting opposite him. The bench groaned under his weight. "I know. You had position. You could have passed. 20 spots, and you were closer to it than half the cadets who made it. I know that too." Kale studied him with the flat, patient attention of a predator trying to solve a puzzle that refused to resolve into a shape he recognized. "I watched the footage from the observation platform," Kale said. "You had a clean path to the beacon at the 11-minute mark. You changed direction toward the sound of a cadet you'd never met, in a species you have no evolutionary alliance with, at a cost you had to know you couldn't recover in time." "I knew." "Then explain it to me," Kale said. "Not as an accusation, as a genuine question. Why spend your strength on a stranger's survival when it costs you your own ranking?" Marcus set down his fork. "Where I'm from, we don't measure who we are by who finishes first," he said. "We measure it by who we don't leave behind. That is an inefficient standard. Maybe. It's the one we've got." Kale was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the mess hall carried on its usual roar of predator conversation. Boasts, rivalries, the low political churn of an academy built on hierarchy. None of it touched their table. "The Ithior cadet you saved," Kale said finally, "has never spoken well of anyone, not her instructors, not her own cohort. She spoke well of you tonight, to the whole first-year hall, in front of cadets 3 times her size. Do you understand what that costs? For a species that survives by never showing gratitude it might have to repay." "That's not why I did it." "I know that's not why you did it. That's precisely what I can't stop turning over." Kale's claws flexed once against the table's edge. An old habit Marcus was starting to recognize as something like thinking out loud. Every species at this academy calculates cost before offering help. It's not cruelty. It's arithmetic. Help costs strength. Strength determines rank. Rank determines survival. You didn't run that calculation. Or you ran it and got a different answer than the rest of us would. "I ran it," Marcus said. "The answer was just never in question." Kale went quiet again, and there was something new in his posture now. Not respect yet. Not quite. But the door where respect might eventually live had, for the first time, cracked open. "That," Kale said, standing, plates shifting with the motion, "is exactly what confuses us. And I suspect it is going to keep confusing this entire academy for a long time to come." He left without another word, but he didn't leave the way he had the first night. Not dismissive, not finished. He left like a cadet carrying a question he intended to keep asking. Across the mess hall, the scarred Dravith veteran who'd once said none of us remember the ones who don't survive sat alone at his usual table, half listening. He said nothing to Marcus that night, made no gesture, offered no acknowledgement. But 2 days later, when a Senkai first year stumbled in the sparring ring and went down hard under an opponent twice her mass, the Dravith was the one who stepped in and called the match. A thing he had never once done in 3 cycles of watching younger cadets get hurt for sport. He didn't explain it. Nobody asked him to. The attack came on the 14th night of the term, and nobody at Predator Academy had trained for it, because nobody had imagined the Academy itself could be a target. A rival faction, Varaxian separatists who considered the Academy's mixed species doctrine an insult to Predator purity, breached the outer perimeter at 0300 hours with disruptor charges and boarding pods, aiming for the dormitory wings where the youngest, least combat-ready cadets slept. The Academy's defenses were built for training accidents, sparring injuries, the occasional cadet feud that went too far, not for a coordinated strike force that had studied the perimeter schedules for months and picked the one night the senior defense rotation was thinnest. By the time the automated alarms cycled through their opening sequence, the Varaxians were already past the outer fence line, moving toward the dormitory wings with the calm efficiency of soldiers who had done this before. Marcus woke to the sound of the first explosion and was moving before the alarms finished their opening cycle. The dormitory wing housing the first years, the same wing where the Ithior cadet he'd saved on the culling field now slept 2 doors down from a dozen others her age, sat directly in the Varaxian's path. He didn't have armor. He didn't have a weapon issued to combat track cadets. What he had was a service knife, a fire suppression line ripped from the wall, and 40 seconds of head start on creatures built to kill. The dormitory corridor was narrow, single-file narrow, built that way for storage efficiency rather than defense. But Marcus had spent 2 weeks walking past it every day, and he knew exactly where it bottlenecked, exactly where the ceiling dropped low enough that a Varaxian's full height became a liability instead of an advantage. He dragged the first 3 unconscious cadets clear of a burning support strut before the attackers even reached the wing, laid them behind a collapsed storage locker, and turned to face the corridor alone. What the surviving witnesses described afterward, Kale among them, arriving 90 seconds later to a hallway that should have been a slaughter and wasn't, was a human using the fire suppression line like a whiplash, driving armored attackers back into the bottleneck one at a time, never trying to win the fight outright, only ever trying to hold the door for 1 more second, and then 1 more after that. He wasn't strong enough to kill a Varaxian raider. He didn't need to be. He only needed to be the reason the raider couldn't get past him before help arrived. He took a disruptor burn across the shoulder that should have ended the fight. He kept moving anyway, not because it didn't hurt, his face, Kale would say later, made it very clear it hurt, but because the youngest cadets, the ones with no plating, no venom, no size, were still behind him and there was nobody else standing in that doorway. By the time reinforcements broke the assault, 6 first-years were alive who had no combat training and no reason to have survived. The Varaxian strike force was repelled with 3 casualties on the Academy side, 2 from the perimeter defense and 1 from the dormitory wing itself. A small Ithior hatchling named Sul, 2 doors down from the room Marcus had cleared first, in the one stretch of corridor he hadn't reached in time. Marcus found him after the fighting stopped, already gone, and said nothing about it to anyone for 3 days. He collapsed in the med bay from blood loss an hour later, and for the first time since he'd arrived, the entire Academy went quiet for a reason that had nothing to do with mockery. Kale sat outside the med bay through the night. He was not alone. The Ithior cadet was there. The Dravith veteran who'd once said none of them remembered the ones who died was there. The Senkai twins, who had never spoken a single word to Marcus, stood in the corridor in perfect silent stillness, which among their kind was its own form of vigil. He had no reason to hold that hallway, the Dravith said quietly. He could have run. His body is built to run. 40 kilometers an hour. Remember? I remember, Kale said. He lost one, the Ithior cadet said quietly, arms wrapped around herself. Sul, 2 doors past mine. I heard the medics say the human hasn't spoken since they told him. Nobody had an answer for that. Predator species didn't carry guilt over incomplete victories. A battle won at 98% survival was still a battle won, filed and closed. What Marcus was doing behind that med bay door, in total silence, didn't have a name in any of their languages yet. So why didn't he run? The Dravith asked again, quieter now. Kale thought of the mess hall weeks ago. We measure who we are by who we don't leave behind. I don't think, Kale said slowly, that running was ever a real option for him. Not because he couldn't, Because some other part of what he is wouldn't let him. Drask, the scarred trial instructor, arrived near dawn, having reviewed the dormitory wing's security footage frame by frame. He said nothing for a long time, watching the closed med bay doors. 11 cycles, Drask said finally. 11 cycles running the culling field. I have taught 300 species what strength looks like. He shook his head slowly. I have never once taught what I watched on that footage tonight. What did you watch? Kale asked. I watched the timestamps, Drask said. He held that bottleneck for 4 minutes and 11 seconds before the first reinforcements reached the wing. 4 minutes is a long time to stand alone against a boarding party with a knife and a hose. I've seen combat track seniors break in under 1. What did you watch? Kale asked. I watched the timestamps, Drask said. He held that bottleneck for 4 minutes and 11 seconds before the first reinforcements reached the wing. 4 minutes is a long time to stand alone against a boarding party with a knife and a hose. I've seen combat track seniors break in under 1. He tapped at his tablet, pulling up a still frame, and didn't show it to anyone. Just looked at it himself, jaw tight. He never once looked back to check if the corridor behind him was still holding. He already knew. He'd made the decision that it would hold, and then he simply made it true. Drask's answer to Kale's next question was quiet enough that only Kale heard it. I watched a creature with none of our advantages choose, freely, to be the wall between danger and the helpless. Not because he was ordered to. Not because it served him. He turned to look at Kale directly. Because it never occurred to him not to. Neither of them spoke again for a long while. Somewhere down the corridor, the first light of the Academy's twin suns was beginning to touch the eastern windows, turning the smoke still hanging in the air a pale, unlikely gold. What did you watch? Kale asked. I watched the timestamps, Drask said. He held that bottleneck for 4 minutes and 11 seconds before the first reinforcements reached the wing. 4 minutes is a long time to stand alone against a boarding party with a knife and a hose. I've seen combat track seniors break in under 1. 3 weeks later, Marcus walked back onto the rim of the culling field for his makeup trial, shoulder still healing beneath his uniform, and found every cadet at the academy already standing there waiting for him. Nobody had told them to come. It wasn't mandatory. Attendance for a repeat trial had never, in academy history, exceeded the cadet directly retaking it and the instructor required to supervise. In 11 cycles, Drask had never seen more than a handful of onlookers bother to show up for a makeup run, usually just a rival hoping to watch someone fail twice. 300 cadets stood along the rim anyway. The Ithior cadet from the rubble stood in the front row, close enough to the edge that a proctor had to ask her twice to step back. The Dravith veteran who'd once said nobody remembered the ones who didn't survive stood a few places down from her, arms crossed, watching with an expression Marcus hadn't seen on him before. Even the Senkai twins, who had never spoken a single word to Marcus in 3 weeks, stood together at the rail, perfectly still, perfectly present. What is this? Marcus asked Kale, who stood nearest the starting line, close enough that his shadow fell fully across Marcus in the low morning light. You held a hallway with a knife and a hose, Kale said. Half this academy has a sibling, a bondmate, or a hatchling who's alive, because you didn't run when running was the correct choice. He shrugged, plates shifting. We wanted to see you finish what you started. Some of us wanted to see it more than we've wanted to see anything in a long time. It's just a trial. It was never just a trial, Kale said. Not after the wing. You know that as well as I do. Drask stepped forward, tablet in hand, and for once didn't recite the standard rules. Cadet Reyes, he said instead. 11 cycles I've run this field. I built it to teach predator species what they needed to become. I never built it to teach anyone what you already are. He lowered the tablet, and for a moment his scarred face carried something almost like an apology. I misjudged you on your first day. I told you to find cover, not glory. I was wrong about which one you were capable of. He raised his voice for the full rim to hear. Reach the beacon, or don't. It changes nothing about what this academy now knows. He stepped back. The field's proximity sensors began their slow, arming hum. the same sound Marcus remembered from 3 weeks earlier, except this time it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a formality the whole crater already knew the outcome of. The horn sounded. Marcus ran, not for glory, not for ranking, but simply because the trial asked him to, and this time there was no one behind him who needed saving more than the field needed finishing. He crossed the collapsed structures, the live-fire corridors, the same maze that had nearly cost him everything 3 weeks prior, moving through it now with the particular ease of someone who had already learned its every angle the hard way. Along the rim, 300 cadets tracked his progress in a silence that had nothing left of mockery in it. He reached the beacon in a time that would have placed him in the top 10 of any year in Academy history. When he turned back toward the rim, every cadet was still standing there. And then, one by one, starting with the small Ithior cadet he'd pulled from the rubble weeks before, they began to strike their chests in the old Predator salute, a gesture reserved, traditionally, only for those the Academy formally recognized as one of their own kind. It rippled outward down the rim, wing by wing, species by species, until 300 cadets who had never agreed on anything else in their lives were standing in perfect, deliberate unison. Threx Kale struck his chest last, and loudest, the sound of it echoing off the crater walls like a second horn. Marcus stood at the beacon and didn't know, at first, what to do with a silence that big. He'd expected mockery on his first day. He'd expected indifference by his 3rd week. He had never once, in any version of this he'd imagined on the transport ride in, expected this. They used to whisper that no human would survive a week here, Drask said quietly to the cadet beside him, watching the field. They'll whisper something different now. What's that? The cadet asked. Drask watched Marcus stand alone at the beacon, 300 predators saluting a species they'd been taught, for generations, to see as prey. A species with no claws, no plating, no venom, that ran at 40 kilometers an hour when frightened. That the galaxy spent 1,000 years teaching us what strength looks like, Drask said. And it took one human, for weeks, and a burning hallway to teach us what strength is for. Down on the crater floor, Kale was the first to break rank and walk out to meet him, and by the time he reached the beacon, half the rim was already moving to follow. Kale stopped in front of him, close enough that his shadow swallowed Marcus whole, and for a moment neither of them said anything. When I first saw you step off that transport, Kale said finally, I gave you a week. I want you to know that. Not because I doubted your courage. I doubted whether courage alone was ever going to be enough against creatures built the way we're built. And now I think I misunderstood which of us needed to change our definition. Kale struck his chest a second time, slower, more deliberate than the first. You were never the one who needed to prove he belonged here, Reyes. We were the ones who needed proof that belonging could look like this. Behind him, the Ithior cadet reached the beacon and, without a word, pressed her small clawed hand flat against Marcus's chest in a gesture that had no formal name in Academy tradition. Something newer, something that hadn't existed until that exact moment. The crater floor slowly filling with cadets who had spent 3 weeks calling him the wrong species and now didn't have a better word for what he was. Somewhere above them, Vosk stood at the observation platform railing, tablet forgotten in his hand, watching the scene with 3 blinking eyes. He found Marcus alone that evening, sitting outside the med bay wing with his duffel bag open beside him for the first time since he'd arrived. A folded strip of cloth laid across his knees, and beneath it, a set of tags that weren't his. I owe you the rest of the truth, Vosk said, sitting carefully on the bench beside him. It was never a clerical error. I flagged it as one because that was the version Sector Command allowed me to tell you. The override on your enrollment was authorized 3 months before your name was even submitted, by a coalition observer who'd spent a year embedded with a human logistics unit during the Thren border conflict. He didn't request a soldier. He didn't request your best. He specifically requested an average one, a baseline recruit, nothing decorated, nothing exceptional on paper. Sector Command wanted to know what an ordinary human was capable of, under our worst conditions, without knowing they were being tested. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. So none of this was about me. No, Vosk said. It was about what you'd turn out to represent. I don't think even the observer expected an answer this loud. He glanced at the tags in Marcus's lap, and had the sense, correctly not to ask. 400 light-years away, in a chamber none of the cadets on that crater rim would ever see, the observer who had authorized Marcus's enrollment sat alone with the same footage they'd just cheered for, the corridor, the 4 minutes and 11 seconds, the salute, and watched it a third time with an expression that had nothing celebratory in it at all. He wasn't reviewing it for the Academy. He was reviewing it for the Coalition Threat Assessment Council, which was the actual reason a baseline, undecorated human had been quietly slotted into the galaxy's most demanding combat program in the first place. Nobody at Caldris had ever been told that. Vosk hadn't known it either. He'd only ever seen the authorization, never the request behind it. Species classification, human. Combat designation, currently listed non-threat, logistic support tier. The observer said into the record, flat and procedural. Recommend immediate review. A voice on the other end of the link, unseen, asked the obvious question. Because he survived. Because of what he survived it as, the observer said. This was not their strongest specimen. Recruitment records confirm baseline physiology, no augmentation, no prior combat service, average scores across every metric we track. He held a fortified bottleneck against an armed Varaxian boarding party with a service knife and a length of hose, at a cost his own species would call devastating and he apparently considered acceptable. A pause. We did not send them our best question. We sent an ordinary one. It gave us an answer no one on this council is going to enjoy. Recommendation. That we stop asking whether humanity could be useful to the coalition, the observer said, and start asking what happens if they ever decide we aren't. The link closed. On the crater floor 400 light-years away, Marcus Reyes was still standing at the beacon with 300 cadets around him who had just decided, for the first time in Academy history, that a human belonged among them. Utterly unaware that somewhere beyond the sky he'd just been welcomed under, a much older and much more careful kind of fear had already begun, and that the next people asked to decide what humans really are wouldn't be cadets at all.